I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The most important words of my life.
I'm here tonight.
I stand
before you today
to declare that I am a candidate
for President of the United States of America.
I am running
for President of the United States.
I officially announce my candidacy
for President of the United States.
I'm running for president.
I am officially running
for President of the United States.
From the University of Virginia Center for Politics, this is Sabato's Crystal Ball, America Votes.
Welcome, everybody, to our very last Crystal Ball webinar before the election. Please remember, we're going to continue the webinars after the election for as long as the election goes on, plus a couple for analysis purposes. But this is our 12th and final Crystal Ball webinar before the actual election tomorrow, Tuesday, November 3rd, recognizing that as an email I just got from NBC and Target Smart, we're up to 94 million votes already cast. It's incredible. That means almost certainly well over half have voted already. Well over half of the people who are going to vote have voted already. So a lot of this election is in the bank, but we all know election day turnout will be of a different partisan cast than the pre-election turnout. We've got a lot more to say. I'm going to turn it over briefly to Kyle Kondik, the managing editor of the Crystal Ball, and he will go through some announcements, and then we'll get to what you're here for, the predictions.
Thank you, Larry. So, of course, it's Monday, November 2nd, it's the day before the 2020 election. If you're joining us for the first time, please subscribe to the UVA CFP YouTube channel. You just hit that subscribe button. And again, this program is also going to be available as a podcast. If you want to support the program, just text USA Votes or text USA Votes to 41444. That's USA Votes to 41444. And we also have a new documentary out at the Center for Politics called Dismantling Democracy, which you can find on Amazon Prime. I guess for this webinar, maybe we should have recorded yesterday the Zoom call we did where we were all flipping coins to determine how we were going to pick the toss-ups. Just kidding, we didn't do it that way. Although for some of these states, I think we probably could have. They're so close, and so let's just dive into it and talk about the Electoral College. So if we could bring up our Electoral College map. This was the final map that we settled on. And really, Larry, different looking map than I think we'd be used to if, in fact, this is how it turns out.
Yes, I think this is somewhat different than we would have picked even a week or two ago. So there you see it. We have Joe Biden at 321 electoral votes. As you know, it takes 270 to win. I'm sure his campaign wishes that this were the final map, or maybe they want it to be bigger. I don't know. And then Donald Trump at 217 electoral votes. Remember, our tradition at the Crystal Ball, and we've been doing this for 20 years, we call everything. We call all the states in the country in the Electoral College. We call every Senate race. We call every House race. And of course, we're going to be wrong in some. I think we're the only ones who, at least the groups that are organized, to call every single election. And we do it because we feel we owe you our best judgment after studying this every single day for years. But we recognize fully that we'll be wrong on some of them. So feel free to disagree and, throw eggs or whatever, virtually. Don't throw real eggs, but virtual eggs are fine. Now, looking at the Electoral College here, you can see that we have kind of a mix and match. We've checked with loads and loads of sources, and we appreciate, by the way, all those sources. And I hope some of you are listening and you accept this appreciation. Obviously, we promised we wouldn't name you, and so we won't. But we've got North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia in Biden's column. We don't expect Biden to win any of them by all that much, but it does seem as though he has a lead of a few points in Pennsylvania, couple in North Carolina. Georgia will be very close, but you would have to give a tiny edge to Biden based on the data we have. We base it on whatever we can gather, the data we can gather, analytics and demographics and polls and everything else. If there's an invisible Trump army out there that's showing up like they did 4 years ago, clearly we're not going to know about that because it hasn't been quantified, at least for us. Now, I think some of you will be surprised that we've kept Florida and Texas in Trump's column. Look, they're both very close, and we had people make strong arguments about putting Florida and Texas in Biden's column, and maybe that will turn out that way. But we thought the predominant evidence suggested that Trump would be able to hold both of them. You also see that we've put Iowa and Ohio into Trump's column. Kyle is Mr. Ohio. He's the guy who's published the book on Ohio politics, Bellwether, and it makes a wonderful holiday gift if you'd like to pick one up through Amazon. He's got a new little baby, so you could buy one and say it's a baby gift. I don't think Aldi would mind. And then some of the others, Arizona, it's close, but we think Biden will win it by a couple points. Nevada, it's close, but not to the point where Biden is likely to lose that. We keep hearing Minnesota's getting closer, but we were unable to get the kind of data that would enable us to move in that direction. Wisconsin, Michigan, yes, they put Trump in the White House, but again, every bit of evidence we can accumulate suggests that Biden will win them this time. Maine 2nd District, we're putting in Trump's column. The rest of Maine, obviously, will be Biden's. And, you can look around the map, make your own decisions, but that's ours. 321 for Joe Biden and 217 for Donald Trump. And what do you have to add, Kyle and Miles?
It would be interesting if this is in fact how it turns out that we would have Ohio and Florida both voting for the losing candidate, which someone actually asked me this morning if that had ever happened before, and I didn't have the chance to go back and look. But I mean, those are sort of the two kind of quintessential key swing states in sort of modern American political history. And again, as Larry suggests, I think both of these states are close. Joe Biden decided to make a last-minute campaign stop in Ohio on Monday, which was kind of surprising. But we're just thinking that Trump won it by 8 points. I just think that's a little bit too much to make up for Biden, particularly if you assume that there may be a little bit of a 1 or 2 point extra edge for Trump amongst white voters that maybe polls aren't picking up. That was sort of our working assumption. Not that we think that the polls are going to be really off, but rather that it's possible that there might be a little bit of an added edge, and the president might be a little bit more resilient in some of these Midwest states than it has seemed. And Florida, I mean, we get a lot of the votes are already cast there. There's a lot of data about the early vote and the mail-in vote. That continues to be close. And in the end, we just think the Republicans have kind of more of the consistent infrastructure in that state to kind of eke out these close elections. But really, Florida has had nothing but close elections in their big gubernatorial and presidential races this decade. Miles, any other observations about the Electoral College map?
Yeah, it's not to take away from Ohio and the Rust Belt, but as much as we talk about the Midwest being the sort of quintessential purple region in American politics, some of the calls that we most agonize over here were in the Sun Belt. Yeah, and that kind of whole string of North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. North Carolina and Georgia are states that the Democrats have been making serious plays at in recent cycles. And then echoing everyone else's comments on Florida, it's almost like it's immune to these national waves. It's always going to be close one way or the other. And just the Republicans have a better record there.
And let me add, this is very important. Kyle, you need to know this. Miles already knows it, but Kyle, you forgot it. In 1960, Richard Nixon carried both Ohio and Florida and still lost decisively in the Electoral College. So I'd like to throw that in. That's really the only election I remember. I start with 1960 because that's pretty much it. Anyway, There you go. Answer your trivia question.
There we go. Yeah, I did.
Final Jeopardy. Okay.
And I also wonder if this election, in some ways, again, if it shakes out this way, and there are a number of different iterations, that this may be sort of the representing kind of the passing of the baton in terms of the Democratic coalition, from kind of being more Midwest focused to more Sun Belt focused. Because over time, you could imagine that maybe the Republicans continue to do better and better in the Midwest, but the Democrats are able to make that up in the Sun Belt. And Larry also mentioned, turnout in Texas is through the roof. I don't think we should be shocked if we have blue Texas on Tuesday night, but we just couldn't quite get there. In terms of following the election tomorrow, consider this. If Biden wins sort of a narrow victory where maybe he wins only the Clinton states plus Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and maybe Arizona, which were some of the states we had leaning to him before our final projection here. We very well may not know the result, particularly because Pennsylvania's vote count seems to be among the most the slowest that we're probably going to have. So one thing to watch, if you want to be assured, I guess, that Biden would win, does he win some of the states where we are going to know the vote counts faster? Does he win Florida? Does he win North Carolina? Does he win Georgia? Does he win Ohio? If he doesn't win, does he win Texas? If he doesn't win any of those, that's where you start to get into kind of overtime and disputed election kind of territory. So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind for tomorrow evening. Anything else? Any other points anyone wants to make on the Electoral College?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see whether the group of people that we talked to who insisted that Biden was going to really run up the score in the Electoral College are right, or whether the people we talked to who think that Trump will pull it out, or that it's going to be very, very close were right, because these are two very distinct camps. I would say fewer people agreed with what we did. It's kind of an in-between centrist kind of thing. And as we've said many times, the center of the road is a 6-inch wide yellow line where you get hit from both sides. So I hope that doesn't happen to us. We'll see.
It is true that I think a lot of people are probably either going like Trump wins or like Biden plus 350. But I think primarily because of Florida, and Florida's 29 electoral votes, and Texas is 38. So if you keep those in Trump's camp, you sort of naturally kind of hold down whatever the size of Biden's margin, if he has a margin, might be. So let's move to the Senate, and let's bring up that Senate map. And Miles, just give us a quick rundown of what we're doing in the Senate.
Sure. So in about April, we did an article talking about the Democrats, what we called their core four pickup prospects. And we identified those as Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina. Well, several months later, here we are. Those are exactly the races that we have the Democrats favored to pick up. So overall, we're looking at 50 seats for the Democrats. We imagine they will have control of the chamber via the tie-breaking vote of Kamala Harris. And one change since last time was almost frustrating for us. For our last time, we moved Iowa from toss-up to leans Democratic. As soon as we moved that rating, we got hit with a lot of pro-Ernst polls. So that kind of culminated with over the weekend we got a poll from the Des Moines Register, which a lot of political junkies consider the gold standard of Iowa. So they had Ernst up 4. So it's just hard to go against someone who knows the state that well. So that's why we moved Iowa back to leans Republican. But overall, on if the night is truly a big night, if Biden ends up winning by something like 300 plus electoral votes, I could see some of these states that we have as leans Republican, a Kansas or an Alaska, potentially electing a Democrat. The one exception we made to moving every state towards one party is in Georgia. We think that both that there's a special Senate election there that's definitely going to go to a runoff, and the regular election there with John Ossoff and David Perdue, The consensus seems to be that Ossoff, the Democrat, may well finish ahead, but he may only get a plurality, which under Georgia law, which would send that race to another run off as well. So we could be here in January talking about these two runoffs in Georgia.
One other kind of overtime prospect for the Senate is that in Maine, that race seems likely that neither Sarah Gideon, the Democrat, or Susan Collins, the incumbent Republican, would get over 50%, in which case it would trigger a ranked choice voting system to determine a winner. And that's another thing that I wouldn't take until January, like potential Georgia runoffs, but it would be kind of an overtime aspect of this campaign. And of course, the vote counts in some of these states, if the races are really close, there's real potential for maybe not knowing the Senate outcome on Tuesday evening. Larry, any points you want to make about the Senate?
I would just reinforce what I think people have been hearing from all media outlets and all sensible political analysts who care about our system. Please don't jump to conclusions. Wait until we have both the election day vote and at least a good portion of the mail-in votes. It's going to take a while in some of these cases. We may have a presidential result sometimes without a Senate result. We could have the opposite too in a few states. But the important thing is that every vote is counted. Every vote counts the same, whether it was done by mail or in person prior to election day or going to the polls on election day. And any attempt, not just by a presidential candidate, but by a Senate candidate to declare victory early should be rejected on its face by everyone, whatever your partisan persuasion, because that's unfair. It's basically saying to the uncounted votes and the voters who cast them, you don't matter, and they do matter.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But Miles suggested this too. Just one final point on the Senate is that there are a bunch of states we have rated as leans Republican. Alaska, Texas now, South Carolina, Montana, Iowa, Kansas. Don't be surprised if one or more of those ends up flipping again if the Democrats have a good night. So there's a possibility the Democrats, extending out the size of a possible majority. It's just that these are all red states. I guess maybe Texas won't be, although we're picking it that way. Very light red state in this election. But if you're looking for upsets, there is the potential there. But we're essentially looking at a Senate that we think is pretty closely divided with sort of a narrow Democratic edge. In terms of the battle for the House, we picked the Democrats to net 10 seats in the U.S. House, so to get to 243 House seats. They have 233 right now. Essentially, we only picked one Democratic incumbent to lose, Colin Peterson in Minnesota, who, of all the Democrats, he's the only one who holds a truly landslide Trump district, which I think imperils him. But for the most part, we sort of favored not just some endangered Democratic incumbents, but also a handful of Republican incumbents. To the extent the Democrats make up ground, a lot of those gains probably would come in places like Indiana's 5th district in the Indianapolis suburbs, Texas 24 in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Georgia 7 in Metro Atlanta, all sorts of kind of places that the Democrats made up a lot of ground in 2018, affluent, highly educated suburban areas, and where the Democrats or where Donald Trump seems to be likely to run behind again this time. Range of outcomes in the House is probably fairly wide. We know, especially in the House, that we're going to miss some of those races. We just hope the overall number is pretty close to that D+10. Governorships, only a handful up this year. We have Montana, an open seat flipping to the Republicans. That's the only change that we have. If that happens, the Democrats would have 23 governorships. The Republicans would have 27 going into next cycle, where we're going to have a Virginia governor race next year. And most of the governorships then have their elections in the midterm year. So these are our picks. We've got Biden favored in the Electoral College, Democrats in the Senate, Democrats in the House, and narrow Republican gain in governorships. Before we finish up, I just want to let you know that starting in a couple minutes, we're going to have the second half of the program. We've got a great interview with Rob Griffin from the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group. They've done a lot of great information about the demographics of the electorate, I've talked to Rob about what the actual demographics of the 2016 electorate were, not just what the exit polls showed, what he's expecting in terms of demographic change in the electorate for tomorrow night and moving forward. So before we get to that interview, Larry, any sort of closing thoughts on
Yes.
election 2020?
You know, a professor always has closing thoughts. He has opening thoughts and middle thoughts. Just one thing, since the beginning of the crystal ball 20 years ago, our motto has been, he who lives by the crystal ball ends up eating ground glass. So everybody who plays this game, you're going to eat some ground glass, and we are too. Just put some Tabasco sauce on it. It's not that bad. Hope you have a great election night and week and maybe month. I hope not, but we'll see.
And we're planning to come back probably on Thursday to sort of sort through the wreckage and determine what we know and what we don't know, and talk about what happened in the election. We're all going to be active on social media, watching the election, doing media and whatnot. So follow along. And thanks to everyone for following along with this webinar. This fall, we decided to do something different. We feel like we got a nice reaction to it. So again, we'll be back next Thursday, and then the following Thursday, November 12th, we're going to be doing we're going to have a great panel for our American Democracy Conference and really pour over what happened. So thanks again. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Miles. It was an interesting weekend trying to put all this together. And hang around for my interview with Rob Griffin from Democracy Fund Voter Study Group. Thanks.
And thanks to our interns at the Center for Politics and Crystal Ball, student interns. They did a terrific job, and we will give them credit by name in the post-election crystal ball. They deserve it.
So pleased to be joined by Rob Griffin, Research Director at the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group. Rob, thanks for being with us today.
And thanks for having me.
So the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group and a lot of your partners have done a lot of work that I've found to be really excellent and very informative. And we're going to get into some of that. But the thing that I always keep coming back to look at is you and some of your collaborators did a kind of an assessment of the demographics of the 2016 election, and what you all found was different than the exit polls found. And I was wondering if, before we sort of look ahead to some of the work you're doing about the 2020 electorate and beyond, I want to look back a little bit on the 2016 electorate, and based on the very detailed research you did, what was the electorate actually like compared to what, say, maybe the exit poll suggested it was like?
Yeah, I think there's one big thing that stood out, and we made it a point in the report, is really just that you see a lot more white non-college voters in the electorate than the exit polls previously suggested. So this was an error that looks like it had been baked into the exit polls for a while. And I do use that word kind of strongly here, like error, like it's not sort of like a difference of opinion. We were talking about a number of white college voters, so they had overestimated the number of white college voters in the electorate that was literally impossible, right? There weren't that enough white college voters. So something was really off the rails. And since then, the good news is that they've corrected it, as near as we could tell, that 2018 forward, they're actually going to have an estimate that looks much closer to reality. I guess we'll see what they say in 2020. But the big thing was that I think they had estimated something like I'm doing it off the cuff here, but I think like 34% of the electorate was white non-college, when the real number was like 10 points higher, where it was closer to like 44%.
And it's interesting that part of what the American Association of Public Opinion Research found after the 2016 election was that some of, particularly the state level polls, maybe were reflecting electorates that, in the pre-election polling, electorates that maybe had a higher education level than actually was true. And it's interesting that this same problem is part of the exit poll, which sort of helps confirm that actually was just a broader problem in polling, right?
Yeah, there was just this participation issue, right? So in polling, you've got some higher status whites, essentially, who are a little bit more likely to participate in polls. And if you're not waiting on it in a very specific type of way, they're going to end up sort of overpopulating your surveys. And in the exit polls, it kind of works out to be the same thing. That it appears to be the case that where the source of the error within the exit polls was just that people with college educations were more likely to make themselves available to be canvassed after they voted.
And so your feeling though is that those conducting the exit polls, and there are a couple. There's the one one that's done for most of the media conglomerates, and then Fox and the Associated Press has been doing their own the Votecast. Is it your sense that they're doing a better job on sort of better reflecting what the electorate looks like?
Yeah, I think the good news is that I think the message got through. Because people had kind of been realizing that it was an issue, and then 2016, I guess, was the turning point. So the good news is that we have reason to believe that it's going to be much closer to reality in both 2018 and 2020. The bad news is that once we get to election night, it's the thing that I worry about. You're going to have all manner of people pulling up the 2016 exit polls and pulling up the 2020 exit polls that are being released that day, and then making these comparisons that you just can't make. That there's, in terms of composition of the electorate, it's not going to make sense. In terms of vote choice, because that has downstream effects on how everything gets calculated, it's going to be incomparable in that way too. I've heard about some efforts to actually trend backwards, right? That people might, I'm not sure if it's going to be an official release or if it's just going to be something talk about that's sort of a retrended exit poll going back to 2016 and even earlier. But unless people are doing that type of analysis, that type of work, they're just not going to be comparable pieces of data. And AP Votecast, again, is a really interesting and new, it's not really an exit poll, but it's a new attempt to sort of study the electorate. It's only been going since 2018 too. So we're really not going to have that 2016 to 2020 comparison on election night that's going to allow people to do the analysis I think they want to do in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah, that's a great point. So your suggestion would be that if you go to CNN or whatever and pull up the 2016 exit poll that still lives there and compare it to what comes out on Tuesday night, you would not compare those two.
Yeah, you're going to mislead. I mean, it's going to look like, whoa, white non-college voters just broke through the ceiling and look how much they turned out. But in a way that's not really reflective of reality, but it's just this methodological shift.
It might make more sense. I mean, again, I respect your guys' work so much. It might make more sense, I guess, maybe to compare like your guys' demographic report and compare that to the exit poll. I know they're probably apples and oranges to some extent.
Yeah.
But at least you all were reflecting the reality that white non-college folks were just making up a bigger portion of the electorate than the exit polls were.
Yeah, and again, I think there's multiple confirmatory pieces of evidence here, right? So Pew did some large studies around this where it did voter validation. They pretty much landed on the exact same numbers that we did for white non-college. So that's pretty reassuring. You have folks like Catalyst who do a pretty good job estimating this. Their numbers are a little bit higher, but again, the direction of the error is saying this is higher. So, I think a good comparison would probably be one of those sources. And just sort of trying to take a look at those trends to identify what's maybe really happened.
One of the things that you all found about the 2016 electorate was that even though in aggregate Hillary Clinton did better than Barack Obama did nationally with white voters who have a four-year college degree, it used to be a pretty Republican group that's now a swing, or even probably in this election a pretty Democratic-leaning demographic group. But in some states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, you interestingly found in aggregate that Clinton basically did no better in those states than Obama did with white college voters. And it does suggest to me potentially that there's some real growth potential for Biden in those states if he can sort of realize those gains that Clinton really didn't realize.
Yeah, and especially if he can pick up, I think, some of the third party vote, right, that happened that election cycle, right? So one of the stories we don't talk about as much is not necessarily how parties gained votes among different groups, but how they lost votes among different groups, which is actually a significant piece of the puzzle there. So I think there's ground to be made up for Biden there if he can do it. And I think another piece of the puzzle is just whether he can overperform, generally speaking, like even among folks who did vote for Trump last time around, and because of a variety of circumstances, might this time be more amenable to a Biden sort of vote.
So another project that you're involved in with Democracy Fund and also UCLA is the Nationscape survey. You all have been, I know, tracking the presidential race, I think, for a pretty long time in this survey. Can you just tell us about this poll and sort of what this poll has been telling us about how the election's been going? Sure. So, this is a really interesting project, and it's very different. We think about like what types of tools are we developing to understand what's happening, and in this one, this is a real sort of microscope, if you want to think about it that way. And essentially, what we've been doing is since July 2019, we've been interviewing about 6,000 people every single week, and we've been doing so again since July 2019. But we're going to do that through the end of the year 2020. So all told, that's going to be about 500,000 interviews.
So what this lets us do is, because we keep the questions pretty much the same, right? We just tried to make a bunch of good bets at the beginning about what would be important, what we'd want to know about. Because we keep it mostly the same, we're able to track that over time. So week by week basis, do we see changes that are interesting or important? I'll give you just a small example. In the immediate aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, as well as the protests that happened, we saw some real changes in regards to attitudes towards police. But again, if you're not in the field kind of like every day, it's something you wouldn't necessarily pick up. But it's a really dramatic, almost overnight shift in some ways. The other advantage that we have is by combining data over time, we're able to do these demographic and geographic deep dives that you're just not able to do in other surveys, right? So even right now, right, we're getting, surveys here and there about Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan about various things, right? We get these little one-offs. What's nice about our survey is that we're actually able to take the same time period, because we're just interviewing people nationally, combined over, let's say, the course of a month, and then come up with comparable estimates for, any number of states on whatever dimension it is that we want to measure. I think one of the important things that we think about the survey too is that there's also, more to the world than horse race polling. There's all these variety of other things that we want to know about the American electorate that may or may not even have to do with the election. It might just have to do with general behavior or general attitudes. I don't think we expected going in that we would be surveying as much about virus or COVID-19 or lockdowns as much as we did. But we think it was important for surveying and understanding people's behavior at the time. But we ask all these additional questions that are really trying to tap into a broader set of concerns. Again, at the end of the day, do we ask horse race questions? Sure. We want to be able to connect these things back to how the political decisions people are making. But we think about ourselves as serving a broader purpose in this way, and hopefully picking up some other interesting dynamics of the race that have less to do with sort of who's up and who's down in a given week.
Of course, the crystal ball, we care so much about who's up and who's down.
Sure, no, I get it.
But it sounds like I've looked at the the polling over time. You all have found pretty steady voter opinions about 2020. That's right?
Yeah, no, I mean, really, this has been a race where Joe Biden has, let's just take the presidential race. Joe Biden has pretty consistently been ahead. Again, we've seen some fluctuations. There's been some time periods where maybe it looks like he was doing a little bit better. Maybe it looks like he was doing a little bit worse. But, I think in the same way that this is reflected in the national polling, it's been really an incredibly stable race compared to, let's say, 2016, when there was a lot of volatility.
Yeah, and that certainly tracks with a lot of the other survey research out there, the national polls and stuff, that it does go up and go down, but it's not really huge dramatic change. You made an interesting observation the other day about some of the early vote statistics, which I think it'd be kind of hard to try to interpret, but that there might be you look at states that have party registration, registered Democrats, registered Republicans, people who don't register with one party. Not every state is like that, but many are, including like Florida and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But you suggested that maybe there might be a disproportionate number of Biden voters in the camp of registered Republicans, or even those who don't register with the party. Why do you think that?
I think it's just because, as strange as it sounds, vote methodology has become a polarized issue, like other things, right? So go back to 2016. You take a look at Trump voters and Clinton voters. There's really not that much difference in terms of how people voted. You could find a couple of points here and there, but it's nothing really to talk about. And then this year, we're seeing such dramatic differences, at least reflected in the polling and some, again, the early vote numbers so far, that there is a political dimension to this, and one that goes beyond just party identification, but goes into actual vote choice, right? So to the extent that there are crossover voters, those are people who are being influenced by the fact that they're supportive of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, and how that's kind of shaping their behavior. So, even when I kind of made that point, right, the idea that however much of a lean you think there is to a particular state's vote totals right now, right? Maybe you think that the vote totals are really blue in Pennsylvania, for example. It could be the case that it's even a little bit more blue than we might think, because of these biases here, that vote for Biden might be making people a little bit more likely to vote. Now, that said, let me back out from that. I actually really don't encourage people to think too much about early vote totals in terms of predicting the race, right? If anything, my point is almost just to suggest, like, hey, this is actually something that has a lot of really weird dynamics to it that we don't understand. And particularly in this election cycle, we don't have a lot of precedent for, right? The value of any piece of information that we have is that we're able to kind of reasonably know what the relationship is between it and election results, or it and something related to the election. And this election cycle is so topsy-turvy that, I think it's just hard to know and hard to predict what the relationship between these various things are going to be until we're on the back end of this. Like, I think there's going to be a really interesting 2020 hindsight type of analysis to say how this all worked and what it looked like. But prognosticating about what it's going to look like or what it portends right now, it feels like people are potentially getting out over their skis.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I mean, it's so tempting. You have all this information out there, and you think, oh, this is important puzzle pieces here. We can really put it together. And, maybe in some states you can. There's been some thought from John Ralston out in Nevada that it's helpful in Nevada, and I think it probably is, but most places it doesn't seem like it actually is. So pretty recently, you and some of your colleagues released the latest report for your States of Change series. You're looking at the kind of changing demographic patterns and their impact on American elections. This most recent study, what was the big takeaway from that?
Yeah, so just to give people a little bit of history here, what we do with the project is we try to understand the political impact of demographic change. In this election cycle, this year, because it's a yearly report, what we wanted to take a look at was generational impacts. We wanted to take a look at what happens because there are going to be fewer boomers in the future and more people who belong to the millennial generation and Gen Z. So let me start with a little bit of throat clearing here. Demography is a destiny. I don't make that argument ever. We think that demography is a really interesting piece of the puzzle to talk about, right? It's just an area that we specialize in to be able to give people some sense of how this piece of the puzzle might help shape and influence the future. But it's, obviously politicians still matter. The events still matter. The actions of political parties that they make collectively still matter. So all that said, I think, one of the stories here that I don't think could be too surprising to people is that if you have fewer boomers and fewer members of the silent generation, who are notably more conservative leaning in most elections, 2020 might be actually a little bit of a weird mix-up this year, but let's say go back to 2016, there's a pretty reliably Republican generation. If there are fewer of those individuals, and over time there are more people who belong to Gen Z and millennial generation, which are notably liberal, you're going to see a more favorable political environment for Democrats. And it's something that on top of demographic change, so just the basic changes that are already occurring to the electorate, becoming more racially diverse, becoming more educated over time, this is going to sort of supercharge that, or could potentially supercharge that under a scenario where people's behavior doesn't change. Now, again, people's behavior very likely will change, right? Political parties will try to accommodate this new political reality. But I think, what our report just kind of tells you is that maybe the direction and the size of this change is sort of interesting to note, because it gives you a sense in this particular case of what the Democratic Party might want to try to capitalize on, and what the hole essentially that the Republican Party will probably need to dig themselves out of in order to be sort of a viable force at the national level.
The Republicans, we're talking a little bit about the split amongst white voters with and without a four-year college degree.
Yeah.
The Republicans' strongest demographic continues to be, white voters who don't have a four-year degree, particularly white men in that category. And this really is a substantial chunk of voters. One of the things that your post-2016 study was so helpful in showing was that group, I think, was 45 or 46% of the entire national electorate was white voters without a four-year degree, right?
Yeah, no, I think when we finally did some revised estimates later based on newer demographic data, it was actually like 44%. But again, still a huge chunk of the electorate. Sure. And it's always worth emphasizing that they punch way above their weight in the Electoral College, and even way above their weight in the House of Representatives, right? So there are lots of groups in the United States that are growing. Let's just take Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans. That are growing in size election over election, but they're just not very well distributed, politically speaking, for the purposes of representation. White non-college voters matter in pretty much I know they for a fact, they matter in every state in the country. And even once you go down to the county level, they're still important in most of them. So again, it's a huge chunk of the electorate. So even at 44, still really massive, but they've been going through a decades-long decline. Right. So, since the 1980s, they've just been shrinking as a share of the electorate year over year. And again, we expect that to continue going forward, probably at the pace of about 2 or 3 points every election cycle. So again, if they were 44% of voters in 2016, this year, again, you'd be surprised how steady the change actually is. But even among voters, we'd probably expect about 42 to 41% this year.
Right. Of course, I think the hope for the president tomorrow night is that that decline maybe doesn't happen, and that he's able to sort of extract bigger margins and more turnout out of this group. But even though it's a big group, is your expectation that the 2020 electorate, in all likelihood, that it will probably continue to get smaller in terms of the white non-college share?
Yeah, the thing is like, I think people always think about this. They go, well, if the turnout goes up, the amount of turnout that would need to go up is just actually much bigger than seems intuitive to the mathematics of it. So like, you really need to put your foot on the gas to really make a difference against these basic underlying demographic changes. That's not to say they can't have an effect. They can. It would really have to be a more dramatic change than the one that we typically see. Just because, again, the basic underlying mechanics of this thing just make it a headwind, I think, for this group to be as big as it ever was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it seems reasonable that if turnout is going to be higher this time, both in terms of percentage of eligible people who show up, and also just in terms of raw numbers. Like we already saw Texas in early vote actually surpass its 2016 raw vote total. Well, that's of course a growing state, but yes, there are going to be new Trump voters coming to the electorate, but there are a lot of new voters coming to the electorate who don't like the president.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you take a look at the new voters, at least from what I've been able to see in the voter file analysis so far. And again, it's coming from a lot of the 18 to 29 population. So again, that's a big chunk of the population that's quite diverse. It's much more diverse than an older generation. So again, it's not to say that a disproportionate number of those voters could be white non-college. But again, you're already dealing with a demographic group that is in some ways has already changed substantially and is going to look a lot more diverse than previous generations.
Rob, last question, and thanks again for joining us right before the election here. One of the big themes, I guess, for Republicans is that because the country is becoming more diverse, they need to try to win or not lose the non-white vote by such a significant margin. And one of the stories that some of the polling, or a lot of the polling, has told this year is that Joe Biden's doing better with white voters, but that Donald Trump may be making some inroads, particularly with Latino voters, but maybe a tiny little bit amongst black voters. Is that something, do you think that that's actually happening? Is that something we might expect in this election?
Yeah, I think it's at least, I think we're seeing enough initial evidence of it that it seems like it could be happening. Again, like for Joe Biden, that kind of trade-off, it doesn't really hurt him at the polls too much. Obviously, again, he's still up high single digits. So it's a trade, given the current demographic composition of the United States, that mostly makes sense for his campaign in the short term. I mean, longer term, again, those kind of pay different dividends if you had a Republican Party that was able to hold on to those margins a little bit better. And particularly among African Americans, right, what we're seeing is that in contrast to other demographic groups where these younger generations are notably more liberal, you're actually seeing a little bit of the opposite potentially among African Americans, particularly African American men. Again, there's a little bit of, I do kind of want to wait for Election Day. I do want to see how the final numbers actually shape up and some of the biggest data sets that we have available and the ones that are most reliably sort of tell us about these populations. But it's still the case that I think that some of the initial signs here is that particularly among young African American men, there might just be margins here that are declining for the Democratic Party. And part of that story, again, we're in a very initial phase if it is happening, is that, there's generational shifts there that kind of matter as well, right? The civil rights generation is moving away. And this was a generation that was heavily attached to the Democratic Party for historical reasons, right? They went through some massive events that fill our history books, right? So it's not the most shocking thing in the world that you might have an African-American population that's slightly less attached to the Democratic Party in the future if they're detached from some of these more seminal events.
One final thing, it's just interesting the difference between black voters and white voters. With white voters, it's pretty clear that the more religious you are, the more Republican or conservative you're going to be. But isn't it different with black voters that if you're black and you're a churchgoer, your Democratic affiliation is probably likely to be even stronger than if you don't?
So there's a great book on this called Steadfast Democrats. And one of the things in the book essentially is about how different types of social institutions, and I should say racially homogenous social institutions. So African Americans for a lot of historical reasons, obviously, inhabit spaces, both in their social networks as well as their religious lives and their educational lives, that are overwhelmingly African American. And those environments play an important part in Black political socialization and for the maintenance of an identity of democraticness, if you want to think about it that way. So one of the dynamics that's been happening to all young Americans, including African Americans, is a rising amount of secularity, right? So there's more and more younger African Americans who are not part of a religious faith community. And given that those faith communities have been such an important part of Black political socialization, in the latter half of the 20th century and now in the 21st century, declining membership in those things might be part of the story about why we're seeing younger African American men in particular maybe moving away from the Democratic Party a little bit. Again, I think this is still one of those let's wait and see type of things. You know what I mean? I think it's still a little early to broadcast about it, but I think some of the I think a lot about demographics, obviously, given some of the work I do, but I think some of the basic moving pieces here seem to make sense to me, at least. They add up to a coherent story about why this might be happening.
Rob, we'll leave it at that. Although, just wanted to ask you, is there anything you want to anything you want to plug?
I don't know if there's anything I want to plug. I mean, what I'll say, I think, especially for folks, is feel free to visit us at voterstudygroup.org. You can learn more about the Nationscape survey that I was talking about today. Also, post-election, we're going to be also sort of releasing reports as well as eventually releasing data from the voter survey, which is a survey where we track some of the same people over time. We've been surveying them since 2011. So these are both sort of interesting pieces of data that we make publicly available. We also write reports about. So feel free to follow us.
Rob, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.